General Maya Roberts stood beneath the soft September sun, her uniform sharp, medals gleaming like silent tributes to a lifetime of sacrifice. Her presence commanding yet humble, as she addressed a small crowd gathered in a city park for a Veterans Appreciation event. Her voice, strong and steady, carried stories of courage, of lives saved and battles fought, not just on foreign soil, but in boardrooms, briefing halls, and within the barriers of identity. A black woman who had climbed the ranks in a system not built to welcome her, Maya had long defied expectation and prejudice, leading with conviction, heart, and an unshakable moral compass. But as she wrapped up her speech, her words about unity and justice still lingering in the crisp air, the mood shifted. From the edge of the crowd, two officers moved toward her with practiced urgency, their hands already hovering near their belts, their expressions unreadable. Confused murmurs rippled through the audience. Maya blinked, momentarily disoriented, not by fear but disbelief. One officer, tight-jawed and avoiding eye contact, asked for her name. When she responded clearly and calmly, his partner interjected with a tone laced in vague suspicion, claiming they had a report of someone matching her description, being involved in an incident earlier in the day. "You must be mistaken," Maya replied, her voice still collected. "I've been here all morning. I'm a speaker at this event." But the officers didn't pause, didn't check, didn't question the incongruity of their claim. They didn't see General Maya Roberts, the war hero, the strategist, the daughter of a civil rights activist. They saw only a black woman standing in public, confident, visible, and therefore to them suspect. The crowd began to stir, some recording on their phones, others shouting out in defense. "She's a decorated general. She was just speaking here." But the officers, seemingly unfazed by the growing concern, told Maya to put her hands behind her back. For a breathless second, she stood frozen, not in panic but in solemn recognition. She knew what this was. Not just a mistake, not just bad policing. It was the latest reminder that no uniform, no rank, no medal could shield her from the weight of her skin in the eyes of those unwilling to see beyond it. As they tightened the cuffs around her wrists, the weight of years pressed down. Not just the years she spent in combat zones, but the years spent proving herself in rooms that doubted her, surviving the cold silences of colleagues who questioned her merit, rising above double standards and whispered critiques. The cold steel on her wrists was nothing compared to the sting of betrayal, by the country she had given everything to protect, and by the justice she had vowed to uphold. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She stood tall, head high, eyes unflinching, even as her hands were forced behind her. She was calm because this wasn't new. It was history repeating itself with sterile indifference. A young girl in the front row, no older than 10, clutched her father's hand, eyes wide as she watched her hero be taken away. Maya saw her and managed the faintest smile, not out of comfort but defiance. She wanted the child to remember not the cuffs but the courage. As the officers led her toward their car, a veteran in a wheelchair tried to intervene, shouting, "This is wrong!" "That woman saved my life in Kandahar," another voice echoed. "You're arresting a national hero." But the officers didn't respond. The sound of protest faded behind her, replaced by the slam of the squad car door. Inside, Maya sat in silence, her breathing steady, her thoughts sharp. She knew this moment would go viral, that people would debate whether it was racially motivated, whether it was lawful, whether she had done something, anything, to justify it. But for her, the truth didn't need public validation. She had lived the contradictions of American justice long enough to recognize them up close. In that back seat, she thought of her mother, who marched in Selma, who had once told her, "This country will love you for your service, but not always for who you are." She thought of her soldiers, especially the young ones who looked like her and looked up to her. She thought of every time she had to be twice as prepared, twice as composed, just to be seen as competent. And still she felt no shame. Only fire. This would not break her. If anything, it would fuel the next chapter of her fight. Not with weapons or tactics, but with truth, with visibility, with the same unshakable courage that had carried her through battlefields. As the car turned a corner and the park slipped from view, Maya Roberts sat tall, even in chains, because she knew that power wasn't in the salute or the stripes. It was in never letting the world decide your worth. On a warm afternoon in September, Maya was walking home from work, earbuds in, the soft hum of music cushioning her thoughts after a long day in the city. She wore her favorite navy blue blazer and carried the weight of someone who always did everything right. Graduated with honors, landed a job she loved, paid her bills on time, smiled at strangers on the street. She was tired but proud. As she waited to cross at a busy intersection, a police cruiser slowed, then stopped near the curb. She barely noticed it until the officer rolled down his window and barked, "You match a description. Need to see some ID." Confused but composed, Maya removed an earbud and asked calmly, "What description?" Her voice wasn't loud, just firm, edged with a mix of dignity and disbelief. That's when everything changed. The officer stepped out, hand already resting near his belt. "Don't talk back," he snapped. Maya raised her hands, palms open, a universal symbol of peace she had practiced in her mind since she was 12 years old. "I'm not talking back," she said evenly. "I just want to understand what this is about." But in the officer's eyes, her tone became defiance, her question a challenge. The second officer arrived moments later, and with him came suspicion layered in assumption. They surrounded her, two uniforms, radios crackling, hands twitching, eyes hardened. Passers-by began to slow down, pulling out phones, watching as Maya stood her ground, breath tight in her chest, dignity battling fear. "Step over here," one ordered. "I haven't done anything," she said, still trying to keep her voice steady. "I have my ID, but I deserve to know why I'm being stopped." And there it was again. Truth mistaken for attitude, composure mistaken for resistance. One officer moved closer. Too close. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he growled, as though her very presence was a provocation. "You're escalating this, not me," Maya responded, her voice cracking slightly. She could feel her heart pounding now, fast and sharp, her fingers trembling though she held them still. The moment was heavy, charged with the weight of so many similar moments before her. Names she had whispered under her breath in prayer. Sandra, Brianna, so many more. She thought of her mother, who always told her to be polite, to be careful, to come home safe no matter what. "Just comply," people would say. But what happens when compliance is never enough? When silence isn't safety and speech is seen as threat? Maya wasn't yelling. She wasn't resisting. She was just asking to be treated like a human being. But that simple request, wrapped in poise and pain, collided with a system not built to hear her. One officer took her arm, not roughly but firmly. It was enough to set the crowd buzzing. "Why are you grabbing her?" someone called out. Another person began recording. The officers looked around, suddenly aware of the attention, but their faces remained set, their posture defensive. "Ma'am, stop resisting," one declared loudly, though Maya hadn't moved. "I'm not resisting," she said again, more to the onlookers now than to the officers. She was trying to stay present, to stay calm, but her voice wavered, her eyes glassy with tears she refused to shed. She remembered the seminar her company held last year on workplace diversity, the way her co-workers had nodded solemnly when she shared how exhausting it was to always be on guard. She remembered her father, who once told her, "We don't get to have bad days, not in public, not where they can see us." And yet here she was on an ordinary day, being reminded again that for some, existing in their own skin was already too loud. After what felt like an eternity, a supervising officer arrived, drawn by the commotion. He spoke quietly to the others, glanced at Maya's ID, and within minutes the tone shifted. Apologies were mumbled, insincere and incomplete. The officers walked away, leaving Maya standing on the sidewalk, her sense of safety shattered but her voice still intact. People approached her, offering support, phone numbers, footage. She nodded, thanked them, but her hands were still shaking. As she walked home, the weight of the moment settled deep in her bones. She had done everything right. She had spoken clearly, calmly, with grace. And still she had been seen as a problem, not a person. Still her voice, measured and true, was twisted into a threat. But Maya knew she couldn't stop speaking. Her voice, after all, wasn't just hers. It carried the echoes of those who never got the chance to speak back, and the hopes of those still waiting to be heard. The moment Maya's body was forced to the ground, the air shifted. What had been a quiet afternoon turned electric with disbelief, then outrage, as the crowd around her transformed from passive onlookers to passionate witnesses. Phones lifted into the air, shaky hands capturing every second as if the act of recording could offer protection or justice. Some pleaded with trembling voices, trying to reason with the officers whose grip tightened each time Maya winced. Others cried out in fury, their faces contorted with helpless rage at the scene unfolding before them. Children clung to parents who shielded their eyes, while elders shook their heads in sorrow, recognizing the haunting repetition of a story too often told. Through it all, Maya remained still, not from submission but from strength. Her eyes, wet with pain, locked onto the sky as if searching for something beyond the blue. Perhaps peace, perhaps an answer, perhaps a reminder of who she was before this moment tried to reduce her to something less. Her hands, pressed to the concrete, trembled only slightly, betraying the searing ache that radiated up her arms and across her ribs where the officers had shoved her down. Yet she didn't scream, didn't beg. Her silence thundered louder than the cries around her, her dignity standing like a monument amidst the chaos. Some in the crowd shouted her name, pleading with the officers to stop, insisting she hadn't done anything, that this wasn't justice, that this wasn't right. A teenager with tears streaming down his cheeks yelled into his phone as he live-streamed, narrating every brutal second for an audience that couldn't look away. A mother near the front sobbed openly, her voice cracking as she whispered prayers under her breath, praying not only for Maya's safety, but for the world her own daughter would inherit. And still, the officers remained unmoved, focused, their expressions unreadable masks behind mirrored sunglasses and clenched jaws. But cracks were forming, not just in the system they represented, but in the collective tolerance of those watching. The crowd's grief began to churn into something else, something heavier, sharper. Every second Maya remained pinned to the concrete added weight to the hearts of those around her, people who saw not just her pain, but their own reflections in her stillness. She could have been any of them, a teacher, a mother, a neighbor, a stranger waiting for the bus, and that truth, so simple yet so devastating, bound the witnesses together in a shared, simmering heartbreak. One man stepped forward, arms raised, voice trembling as he begged the officers to let her up, to listen, to see her humanity. He was pushed back. Another woman tried to approach with her hands open but was warned to stand down. The injustice was palpable, thick in the air, pressing down on every chest. Still, Maya didn't break. Her face, despite the bruising, held something sacred, an unspoken resolve, a refusal to be humiliated. She wouldn't let them have that. She wouldn't let the world forget who she was beneath the headlines that would follow. Around her, the crowd swelled with emotion. Strangers united in a moment of collective reckoning. They didn't all know Maya, but they knew what she represented. Every overlooked voice, every quiet strength mistaken for weakness, every person who had ever been told to be small when they were born to stand tall. In that moment, she was not just one woman. She was many. She was history and future, pain and pride, silence and scream. When the officers finally pulled her up, rough hands on her arms, the crowd surged forward again, not in violence, but in solidarity. The recording didn't stop. The cries didn't stop. And Maya, though wincing, though limping, raised her head and looked straight ahead. Her chin lifted not in defiance, but in remembrance of every name uttered in marches, every face printed on signs, every heartbeat lost to injustice. She would not be another forgotten headline. The crowd saw it too, their eyes wide with understanding, their hearts beating in rhythm with hers. They had come as bystanders, but they would leave as witnesses, and long after the sirens faded and the officers drove away, long after Maya disappeared from sight, her image, dignified, hurting, whole, remained burned into every soul present. In their minds, she stood not as a victim, but as a quiet warrior, a testament to endurance, to grace under pressure, and to the power of being seen, truly seen, even in the worst of moments. Maya sat quietly by the window, the late afternoon sun spilling across her lap like warm honey, casting long shadows that danced on the hardwood floor, shadows that felt eerily familiar, like ghosts of battles long past. Her hands, now worn and trembling slightly with age, rested on her knees, yet they still held the memory of strength, of protest signs gripped tight in fists, of babies held through tear gas marches, of freedom papers folded carefully into coat linings just in case she never came back. Her mind wandered through decades of service, years spent organizing voter drives in the Deep South, speaking in front of school boards that once barred her from entry, standing unshaken in the face of snarling dogs, raised batons, and laws that treated her humanity as negotiable. She had lived her life with purpose, every breath a quiet rebellion against the roles others wrote for women like her, for black women who were told to keep their heads down, speak softly and serve. And serve she did, but not in the way they expected. She served her people. She served justice. She served the idea that a little girl born on a cotton field could grow into a woman who'd sit at tables once closed to her ancestors. But now, years later, in the comfort of a home she had worked tirelessly to build, not just brick and wood, but legacy and love, she found herself treated like furniture. Her son's new wife, well-meaning in her own blind, brittle way, barely looked Maya in the eye, always speaking over her, around her, as if Maya's presence was ornamental, not essential. She often forgot to serve her tea, didn't realize Maya was still sitting at the dinner table, or gently suggested she go rest when guests arrived. It was subtle, never outright cruel, but it was there, in every dismissive smile, every unspoken message that Maya's time had passed, that she was now just an old woman with stories no one had time to hear. Yet in those quiet dismissals lay a deeper insult, because Maya had not simply aged, she had endured. She had not just watched history, she had shaped it with her bare hands. She had watched friends bleed on courthouse steps, had marched until her feet blistered raw, had taught her children how to hold their heads high in a world that wanted them bowed, and now, to be patronized in her own home, to be ignored by someone who had reaped the benefits of freedoms Maya had fought for, was an irony so bitter it curled in her chest like smoke. She didn't need a parade. She didn't want medals. She had never lived for applause. But what she longed for, what she deserved, was to be seen. Truly seen, not as a relic of a struggle long past, not as a grandmother confined to stories and soft blankets, but as the warrior she still was beneath her quiet, aging skin. She recalled the time she sat in a jail cell for refusing to move to the back of a bus, the ache in her back soothed only by the knowledge that she had stood up for something sacred. She remembered the night her eldest son, only 13, was stopped by police, and how she had stood between him and their guns with a calm fierceness that had made them hesitate. Her strength had never come from shouting, but from enduring, from loving so deeply that she was willing to fight for a world her children could survive in. And now she was still fighting, just differently. Fighting to hold on to her dignity in a space that kept trying to shrink her, fighting the quiet ache of being forgotten. But Maya would not shrink. She could not. Even in silence, her presence carried the weight of generations. Her scars, though invisible to most, were medals of honor etched into her soul. She turned from the window, watching her granddaughter giggle softly in the next room. That child would never know the taste of separate fountains, the fear of walking alone at night in the wrong part of town, or the quiet rage of being called girl by a man half her age. And that, Maya thought, was victory. That was the fruit of her labor. She smiled, a small, tired smile, and rose slowly from her chair, every joint creaking in protest, but her heart steady as ever. The world had not broken her. Not in Birmingham, not in D.C., and certainly not here. In this house she helped build with love and sacrifice. She walked toward the kitchen where laughter echoed, and though no one had asked for her voice, she would speak when she was ready. Because Maya had earned her place, not just in this home but in history, and no subtle slight or careless whisper could erase that. Her strength wasn't in proving she belonged. It was in knowing she always had. The air inside the operations center was thick with tension, as though the very walls held their breath, unwilling to echo the chaos unfolding within. Maya stood frozen, her pulse hammering in her ears, unable to fully comprehend the sight before her. General Ethan Cole, respected, decorated, revered, was being escorted out in cuffs, his face carved from stone but his eyes burning with something deeper than shame. Disbelief flickered across every face in the room, each colleague too stunned to speak, the weight of betrayal suffocating the usual order of protocol. But Maya knew Ethan. She had worked beside him for over a decade, had seen his integrity withstand impossible pressure, had witnessed firsthand the sacrifices he made not for power or recognition, but for country, for people, for peace. This arrest did not make sense. It reeked of something larger, something darker, a move orchestrated not by justice but by political theater. She scanned the room looking for someone to move, someone to act, but they were all paralyzed, puppets cut loose from their strings. Then she saw David, her closest confidant in the building, a man who had always kept his head when others lost theirs. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on the general. Being dragged away. "This isn't right," he whispered. barely audible above the hum of electronics and the distant, curt commands of military police. Maya nodded once, a silent agreement blooming between them. And then, without a word, David turned and walked briskly to the secure comms desk. Every movement felt like defiance, every step a rebellion against the silence that had swallowed the room. He picked up the red line, the direct channel to the Pentagon, and input the emergency override code, something reserved for moments of national crisis. His hands shook slightly as he brought the receiver to his ear, but his voice, when it came, was calm, clipped, unmistakably urgent. This is David Reznor, Intel Division. Code clearance Bravo Victor 7. I'm reporting the detainment of General Ethan Cole at Ops Center 4. Immediate escalation requested. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that only came from high places scrambling for clarity. Maya watched him, her breath caught between hope and dread, her hands clenched so tightly the nails bit into her palms. Around them, others began to stir, murmurs growing louder, fear giving way to suspicion, suspicion giving way to a shared unease. The dominoes had begun to fall, and no one knew where they would land. David's voice remained steady, a thread of sanity in the growing whirlwind. There are inconsistencies. No prior briefings, no standard warnings, no legal hep. This feels like a takedown, not a legal process. If this is an internal matter, it's bypassed every protocol we've trained for. On the line, a general responded not with dismissal but with a stunned silence, followed by clipped words and a promise. We'll look into this immediately. Keep your comms open. David placed the receiver down with a soft click, and the room seemed to exhale, if only slightly. Maya stepped forward, her voice finally returning to her. They didn't even give him a chance to speak, she said, her voice laced with quiet fury. He's the kind of man who carried burdens that would have broken the rest of us. And this is how they repay him? David looked at her, his face a mixture of weariness and determination. That's why we called. Because if we stay quiet now, we become part of it. Maya nodded slowly, her throat tightening with emotion. She thought about the years of loyalty, the missions where Ethan had risked everything for lives most people would never know existed. She remembered his quiet guidance, his firm but kind leadership, the way he'd always said, "You don't fight for the system. You fight for what the system should be." And now, as he sat somewhere behind reinforced steel doors, alone and likely already being questioned without representation, that principle hung in the air like a silent vow. The call had been made. The alarm had been sounded. And whatever storm was coming next, Maya and David knew they wouldn't face it in silence. They would fight, not just for the general, but for the truth, for the honor of a man who had never once let his country down, even when it demanded more than it gave. Outside the tinted windows, dusk began to settle over the base, shadows stretching long and uncertain. But inside the operations center, something had shifted. Fear had turned to resolve. Silence had given way to courage. And in the quiet aftermath of a single phone call, the battle for justice had already begun. The news hit the Pentagon like a thunderclap, sharp, sudden, and impossible to ignore. In the echoing halls of power, where every whisper could shift the course of nations, this was more than just a whisper. It was a siren. High-ranking officials, some veterans of war and diplomacy alike, froze mid-sentence as encrypted messages lit up their secured devices. The situation had escalated far beyond political optics or public relations. It was now a matter of national integrity. At first, there was disbelief, eyes narrowing over reports, coffee cooling in untouched mugs, and silence stretching through meeting rooms where certainty usually reigned. Then came the outrage, not loud or chaotic, but seething, the kind of fury reserved not for enemies abroad, but for failures within. The prejudice that had gone unchecked at a high-profile event, involving key figures and potential allies, was not just a social misstep, it was a strategic disaster. Ava's quiet exit, captured by a single distant lens and transmitted through confidential channels, had set off alarms not because she left, but because of why she left, and what her departure now symbolized to the world watching. She wasn't merely a guest. She was a liaison, a bridge between old institutions and emerging global alliances. And now that bridge was burning in full view. The implications were vast. International trust was at stake, diplomatic momentum threatened, and a long-fostered agreement now teetered on the edge of collapse. In the secure conference room layered in reinforced steel and decades of military history, generals and analysts gathered without delay, each aware that the cost of inaction could reverberate through generations. Someone slammed a folder onto the table, pages spilling with transcripts, timelines, and facial recognition stills, each one painting a picture of an evening that had gone from opulent to catastrophic in under an hour. "How did we not see this coming?" one official murmured, more to himself than anyone else, but no answer came. Because they had seen it, or rather they'd glimpsed it in briefings and overlooked it in memos marked low priority. Warnings about cultural insensitivity. Reports on systemic bias. Feedback from junior staff who were too often dismissed. It was all there, buried under bureaucracy and arrogance until it exploded in real time. Now the Pentagon, an institution that prided itself on foresight and control, was left reacting, chasing the fallout of a moment they should have prevented. Ava's background, her intelligence contacts, and her quietly growing influence made this more than a scandal. It was a breach of credibility, one that foreign entities would be swift to exploit. Across the room, a woman in uniform, sharp-eyed, composed, stood and began issuing directives. "We move now," she said. "Not tomorrow, not after another briefing, now." There was no resistance. A task force was assembled within minutes, not for cover-up, but for course correction. They would reach out, not just to Ava, but to the communities she represented, not as a gesture, but as a promise. They would begin the slow, necessary work of dismantling the walls that had led to this fracture. For some, the urgency felt overdue. For others, it was the first time they truly understood how fragile their authority was in a world demanding equity, not just power. Outside, dusk settled over Washington, D.C., the city unaware of the storm behind those fortified walls. But inside, the Pentagon was a hive of movement. Encrypted calls placed to diplomatic partners, internal reviews launched, silent nods exchanged between those who understood the stakes. Amid it all, one advisor stared out a narrow window, her reflection faint against the glass, and wondered how many more Avas had walked out of rooms unseen, how many had left, not because they lacked the will, but because they lacked the invitation to stay. That thought, more than the geopolitical risks or media scrutiny, haunted her most. This wasn't about one deal or one family's misstep. It was about a legacy that could no longer afford to be blind to its own shadow. In that moment, the Pentagon, often perceived as cold and calculated, became something else entirely: humbled. The institution, built to defend a nation, was now forced to confront a truth it had long buried: that true strength lies not in might, but in justice. And so, beneath the hum of surveillance monitors and beneath the buzz of war room chatter, a new kind of mission was quietly born. Not one of force, but of accountability. Not about reclaiming lost ground, but earning back trust. One action, one apology, one change at a time. The shockwaves would continue, reverberating through policies, alliances, and hearts alike. But something had shifted at the core. And for the first time in a long time, the Pentagon wasn't just preparing for conflict. It was preparing to listen. The sirens had already begun to fade into the background when Maya found herself pressed against the cold hood of a police cruiser, the gravel beneath her knees biting into her skin, her arms twisted behind her back while two officers barked commands she couldn't even process. It all happened so fast. Blue lights flashing, doors flung open, bodies rushing toward her with hands already reaching for weapons and cuffs, their eyes filled not with concern or curiosity, but with the assumption of guilt. She hadn't resisted, hadn't even spoken, too stunned by the sudden eruption of force in a quiet street that just moments before had felt like home. Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to tell them who she was. But the weight of their judgment silenced her before she could form the words. Around them, a small crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors, strangers, faces in windows, some filming, some frozen in place, all witnessing a scene far too familiar to those who looked like Maya. The officers barked questions without waiting for answers, their tone sharp, rehearsed routine, like they'd done this 1,000 times before and didn't need facts to finish the script. One of them, younger, visibly on edge, pressed harder on her back, eliciting a sharp gasp that made her bite her lip in pain. The other shouted for identification she couldn't reach. Her purse lay a few feet away, spilled open during the takedown, her ID somewhere among the contents, but no one seemed interested in retrieving it. Fear churned in her chest, raw, primal, not just fear. Of injury, but of erasure, of becoming yet another name in a news cycle or a statistic whispered at community meetings. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother's voice, calm and proud, telling her, "You come from women who do not shrink." But in this moment, Maya felt impossibly small. Then, just as suddenly as the chaos began, a shift. One of the officers paused, touching his earpiece, his expression hardening, not with aggression this time, but confusion. "Stand by," he muttered, stepping away from her, hand still hovering near his holster. A beat passed. Then another. The second officer glanced over, annoyed, until he too received the same call. "We have a positive ID. Stand down immediately. Repeat, stand down. Do not engage further." The shift was immediate and uncomfortable, like the sudden flick of a light in a dark room. Their hands released her. The weight lifted. She was helped, not gently but awkwardly, to her feet. The younger officer avoided her gaze. The other cleared his throat, his voice suddenly lower, more careful. "Ma'am, there's been a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. 2 minutes ago she was dangerous. Now she was ma'am. Maya stood there, her chest still rising and falling too fast, the imprint of the gravel embedded in her skin, and stared at them. "You didn't even ask who I was," she said quietly, the words cracking under the strain of everything she wasn't allowed to feel a moment ago: terror, humiliation, rage. The older officer stammered something about protocol. The younger one picked up her bag, handed it to her without meeting her eyes. From across the street, someone shouted, "Too late for that!" as a woman filmed the whole interaction with trembling hands. Then came the real twist, the unspoken reason for the sudden reversal. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and out stepped a sharply dressed man with an earpiece and a pin that signaled federal clearance. He approached Maya directly, nodding with deference, not authority. "Ms. Bennett," he said, loud enough for the officers to hear, "your father is on the line. He asked me to escort you safely." The officers stiffened. One actually took a step back. Maya didn't move. She simply looked at the man, then at the officers, then at the watching crowd. Her mind raced, not with fear now, but with clarity. They hadn't stopped because they realized they were wrong. They had stopped because they realized she was someone important, someone with power. Her father, a federal judge known for his unapologetic stance on civil rights and his insistence on justice, must have heard. Someone must have called. It shouldn't have taken all of that. It shouldn't take a name, a title, or a connection for someone like her to be treated like a human being. She wanted to scream, to cry, to disappear, but instead, she straightened her spine, nodded to the agent, and walked past the officers without a word. Not because she forgave them, but because she refused to give them anything more than they'd already taken. As she stepped into the car, the crowd slowly began to disperse, but the story was far from over. The footage would go viral. The truth would come out. But the turning point wasn't when the officers stood down. It was when Maya stood up, not just physically but fully as herself, no longer afraid, no longer willing to shrink. The walls that once protected them began to shake. For years, the high-ranking officers had operated with quiet impunity, cloaked in titles, medals, and the sanctity of uniform. Symbols that once commanded respect now offered no shield from truth. When the scandal broke, it didn't just ripple. It thundered, shaking the pillars of power that had long stood unchallenged. At first, they denied, deflected, and dismissed. They leaned on influence, hoping the noise would fade like so many others before. But this time was different. This time, the world was watching. And in the heart of the Pentagon, where silence once meant survival, there was now only one demand echoing through corridors of power: accountability. The evidence was damning. Paper trails, testimonies, recordings, all pointing to an ugly truth buried for too long. What had been whispered in corners was now shouted from podiums. Investigations launched with urgency. Oversight committees moved with precision. One by one, the officers were called in, not as leaders but as subjects of inquiry. Their posture changed. The bravado dimmed. The halls they used to stride through with pride now seemed colder, narrower, judgmental. Suspensions came swiftly. Badges turned in with trembling hands. Once hailed as decorated heroes, they now faced cameras with lowered eyes, their names making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Families watched in disbelief. Children saw their parents differently. The people who had sworn to protect justice had betrayed it, and there was no hiding from the consequences. The public, long fatigued by stories of injustice swept under the rug, finally saw the machinery of power grinding to a halt, demanding not just apologies but answers. Some officers tried to plead ignorance, others blamed the system. But the weight of silence, complicity, and unchecked authority bore down like a tidal wave. Their legacies, once carved in polished plaques and framed commendations, now lay in pieces. And it wasn't just their careers unraveling, it was their identities. For men and women who had spent decades building lives inside the institution, who believed rank granted them a kind of invincibility, the reckoning felt personal, almost surreal. They weren't just losing jobs, they were facing the collapse of everything they thought they were. Outside protests turned into vigils, not for them, but for the victims their choices had buried. Survivors who had once been silenced now spoke freely, powerfully, and the truth in their voices could no longer be ignored. What the officers failed to realize was that leadership is not measured by stars on a shoulder, but by integrity in the dark. And now, stripped of title and command, they stood like anyone else, accountable, flawed, human. One officer, once a general with accolades lining his office, now sat alone at a hearing table, his voice cracking as he stumbled through explanations that felt more like confessions. Another, who had mentored dozens, now struggled to explain how he ignored the reports, how he convinced himself it wasn't his fight. And in those moments, raw and public, the nation saw not monsters but men who made devastating choices, and learned too late that silence is not neutral, it's complicity. The Pentagon, in an unprecedented move, issued a statement not of vague regret but of firm commitment. This would not be buried, and this culture would not continue. It was a seismic shift in tone, one that signaled to every level of the military that the era of cover-ups and quiet transfers was over. Accountability had arrived not just as punishment but as a mirror. Some within the ranks welcomed it, others resisted, but all knew the tide had turned. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were tangible, career-ending, legacy-shattering. For the officers who once believed they were untouchable, the fall was steep and sobering. Some would face courts-martial, others civil suits, and all would carry the stain of what they had done or failed to do. Their families, their communities, their fellow service members, all reeled from the betrayal, and yet in that reckoning there was also the beginning of healing. The system, flawed as it had been, was now being held to its own standards. And for those who had waited too long for justice, this accountability was not vengeance but validation. It meant their pain had been seen, their voices heard. The officers, once symbols of strength, now symbolized something else. The urgent need for reform, for leadership that listens, for courage that does not cower in the face of truth. Their disgrace was not just a fall from grace, but a necessary chapter in a larger story. A story of institutional awakening, of culture shifting, of power being questioned for the first time in generations. And in the quiet after the storm, one thing was clear. The reckoning was not the end. It was the beginning of something long overdue. As the sun dipped below the city skyline, casting a soft golden hue across the gathering, Maya stood before the crowd, her heart full, her voice steady, and her spirit unshaken. The past weeks had been a storm of revelation, courage, betrayal, and transformation, but in this moment there was peace. Not the peace that comes from silence, but the kind that follows truth being spoken aloud and justice beginning to take root. Faces in the crowd mirrored her journey. Some tear-streaked, others quietly smiling, all of them holding the weight of the story that had brought them here. Maya, once a quiet figure in the background, had become a voice for the silenced, a symbol of endurance born from pain. She looked out not at strangers, but at people who had seen the darkness for what it was and chose to stand in the light. Her voice rang out, not loud but strong, each word carried not just by her lips but by the lived experience of those who had walked beside her. We have been told to be silent. We have been taught to endure injustice as if it were a price we must pay for survival. But today we rewrite that story. A hush fell not from absence of sound but from the gravity of truth. When the powerful tried to bury us in shame, when they used wealth to silence truth, they underestimated what resilience looks like. They forgot that dignity doesn't die quietly. It fights, it breathes. It survives in every person who refuses to look away. Behind her, images of protests, press conferences, and courtroom testimonies flashed on a screen, each one a scar, but also a symbol of healing. "I was afraid, Maya,"